Hello and welcome to a Sunny Book Nook. Today I'm going to be bringing to you my April wrap-up. My name is Sunny, I use they them pronouns, and I have a little bit of a mushroom look, psychedelic sleigh going on today. I have my physical books that I read this month in one hand, my journal in the other with my reading stats. So let's just get into it. In terms of numbers, I read 25 books this month, which is, I think, fine, but not my best. Because quite a few of them were short stories or like on the shorter end of things, so it's not that impressive, you know. Anyway, so in terms of genre, I read one short story collection, two like short stories that were individually published, and 9 literary fiction books, 3 nonfiction books, 2 romance novels, 1 classic, 1 science fiction fantasy, 2 thrillers, 3 fantasies, 1 play. Awesome. And in terms of format, the large majority of these I listened to on audio, so 19 of them were audio, 2 of them were like ebooks or PDFs, and 4 of them are physical or like I physically own and physically read. In terms of star ratings, I had 1 unrated, and that's because it was a play, and I'll talk about it when I get to it, but 1 2.5 star, 6 3 star, 1 3.5 star, 9 4 stars, 5 4.5 stars, and 2 5 stars? Like, whoa, because I've only had 3 fiction 5-star books this year. Or 2, because one of these books is technically like nonfiction, but in terms of like length, I would argue that 11 of these books are on the short side, and then 11 on like medium length, and then 3 were long. In terms of author race, 20 of the books I read were written by white authors. Some of them are the same author, so 1 black author, 2 Asian authors, 1 Middle Eastern, North African author, and 1 Latin American author. So, not great on diversity, but it is what it is. In terms of author gender, I read 21 books written by women, 2 books written by men, 22 books written by women, 2 written by men, and 1 written by a non-binary author. So, yeah, typical stats in terms of gender. Also, sorry if you can hear noises. People are like moving furniture upstairs right above me. I don't fucking know. Now to get into the books that I read in the order that I read them, I think I'm also going to rate the accuracy of the title, or like the way that the title is, and then the cover, because I like talking about those things. I'm just looking at my Goodreads, which you can find me on Goodreads if you want, but you have to answer the prompt, the challenge question, because I don't want randos friending me on Goodreads, you know? The first book that I read in the month of April was Vladimir by Julia May Jones, and I rated it 4 stars. I really liked it. And in terms of the cover, I like the cover. I really like the font of the text. I think that the photograph, it's like, okay, something, I don't know, but I think it conveys what the story is about, you know? And the title being Vladimir, I guess it makes sense, because Vladimir is the character that our main character, who is an English professor at like a small liberal arts college on the East Coast, is super obsessed with, and she and her husband are in like an open marriage. They're both college professors, and basically her husband is under fire because he has had relationships with some of the students on campus, and yeah, it's a lot of really interesting relationships and characters who have varying levels of tension. It's very much about like academia and literature as well. And I think that if you like the TV show The Chair on Netflix with Sara A, you would probably enjoy this book as well, because it's very much about like campus politics and the students and teacher professor dynamics. And yeah, I liked it. I thought it was very interesting and gripping, and there's a lot of discussion about gender, obviously, and being like a woman in academia, but also just like being a woman and a in general and like into literature. It's very obvious that the person who wrote this is herself an English professor, so you know, there's that. But yeah, I liked it. I had a good time. It's very much like literature about literature, which I think is thematically relevant in the books that I read this past month. The next book that I read was Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan, which is a really short little book that follows... It's set in Ireland during the Troubles in like the 90s, and we're following this man who is like a repairman, and he has a family and a wife and daughters, and there's sinister things going on in the small town, but it's unsure, like it's kind of vague. It very much is deeply moving, and it feels like a very wintry sort of book. I enjoy the cover, I like the green, and I like the font, but it's sort of like mid, maybe like 3.5 star cover, but I gave the book 4 stars. So the next book that I read was Slouching Towards Bethlehem by Joan Didion, which is like a classic. All the gays read it. Everyone has read this fucking book. I annotated and highlighted like a fair bit of this, and I think that a few of the essays are really compelling, but some of the other ones weren't as much. And I get why she is a lauded writer, and you know, rest in peace. But I think I gave this like 3.5 stars because I don't know whether this genre of like personal essay is necessarily for me or just essay in general. I don't know. But I do understand its merits, and I think that the cover and the title, it's beautiful, of course. So yeah, I need to read more Joan Didion, but this is the first book of hers that I've picked up, and I liked it well enough. 3.5 stars. Okay, so the next book that I read was The Lying Life of Adults by Elena Ferrante, which I rated 3 stars. I don't know, I feel like Ferrante is one of those authors who is deeply, deeply hyped, and I don't know whether I'm totally buying into it, I guess. I think that the way that this book explores like gender and coming of age and girlhood in Italy particularly, and the real complicated family dynamics, because basically our main character is this girl who is in this family that has a complicated past, complicated history. Her dad's side of the family is kind of fucked up. He doesn't talk to his sister, her aunt. And there's all these like secrets, and I don't know. It didn't really grip me in a way that I wanted it to, and I don't know whether it talked about the issues that it was trying to address in a way that I was the biggest fan of. I don't know. So yeah, I rated it 3 stars because I can totally understand the merits of its writing, and I can totally get why people like it, and I understand that objectively it's probably good and I'm missing things, but I don't know. I like the color scheme of the cover though, and I think the title is fine. Like, it makes sense for what this book is about, because it is about the lying life of adults, but I feel like I've read more interesting books about girlhood and coming of age that didn't make me feel gross in a way that this book did. I don't know. The next book that I read was a classic, Sister Carrie by Theodore Dreiser, and by read, I mean like there were parts of it that I annotated very thoroughly. There were parts of it that I kind of skimmed past, but I feel like that's how you read classics, or at least that's how I read it, and I liked it. I rated it 4 stars. I think that the exploration of like wealth and the Gilded Age and social climbing and women's relationship to men, it was very incisive, especially considering it was written in the early 20th century by a man. I think it talked about like women's issues and women's relationships to men in a really interesting way, because we're following this girl named Sister Carrie, obviously, and she goes to Chicago, stays with her like aunt, and she's working these like low-wage jobs, but on the train to Chicago she runs into this guy named Drew A, who in Chicago basically seduces her, well not seduces, but like makes her his mistress kinda, and then she gets into acting, and then she finds another dude that she's with, and then they run off together. It's a whole situation, you know? And I liked it. I think that the writing was good, and it's a classic for a reason. I think that this edition, there's so many editions of every classic, with this edition, the cover, just mid, you know? And of course the book is called Sister Carrie. I'm not deeply compelled by it, I suppose, but it's a solid classic. Alright, the next book that I read was a short story called Junket by Lauren Groff. I really like Lauren Groff's writing. I've read her short story collection Florida, which I really enjoyed. And I've also read her book Matrix, which I also fucking loved. And this book, or this short story I read like on Scribd, I think it's like a Scribd original. It's about this woman who's going to this conference, or not this conference, this like retreat as a literary speaker and a guest, because her friend who was supposed to be like the keynote speaker for this self-care, personal care event, spa treatment thing, couldn't go, and so she was the replacement, I guess. And it's about her contending with her identity and her reality as an author, and also like wealth. And obviously it's a short story, but I really liked it. I really like Groff's writing, so I think that this story just fell flat in some ways, and it's just not that memorable for me. And I think that the title and the cover are also quite mid, and I rated it 3 stars, so yeah. The next book that I read was a short story collection called The Last Suspicious Holdout by Ladee Hubbard, which I rated 4 stars, and I really enjoyed. It's short stories that are all like loosely connected by the fact that it's all these characters who are from the south side of Chicago, essentially. I'm pretty sure. I think that's where it's at. But the first short story is following this girl who like grew up in a Caribbean island, I'm forgetting which one, but then moves back to the US when she's like 8, and there's like these weird social dynamics among the kids, and there's this grandma who like gives people Kool-Aid, and then we follow a short story with the grandma's kid who does stuff, and then we also follow this guy who was like a political prisoner, and he set up a community center that his brother now runs, but he's still in prison. And there's a lawyer who's working pro bono for them. And then we're also following this lady who works this fast food chain, kind of like McDonald's or whatever. She works in corporate. Each of the short stories, like, we're following characters who are also different from each other and all have very different perspectives on like their approaches to life. And there's almost like a spiritual or like magical element to it, which I thought that was like really well done. And I think that the cover is really beautiful. I love like all the vibrant colors. Alright, so the next book that I read was Reputation by Lex Croucher, which I rated 4.5 stars. This was a really delightful historical romance that follows this like friend group of people who are like, our main character is coming from a like more low class like social background, but they're all like, you know, pretty wealthy. They're all in like the London elite circles, and she gets sort of enfolded into this clique, and she is kind of into this dark, brooding, mysterious guy who is sort of socially isolated from the rest of the group. But within that group itself, there's quite a few like queer characters, and we see that sort of reality, and it's all about like that social hierarchy. Ultimately, it's very like Mean Girls set in, you know, like 19th century, whatever. I thought that it was really, really sweet. The writing was like really easy to get into, but it didn't feel corny or anything, and it was just like fast moving, and the main relationship was also really compelling, and also the way that all the characters, the social dynamics and hierarchies as described, were like, it was just good. I really liked it as a historical romance, and I thought that it was very interesting seeing our main character who's like really into reading, and she's staying with her aunt, and like she has a complicated relationship to her parents who have sort of abandoned her, she feels. And then there's one of the other main characters who is black, but it's because like her mom is from like the West Indies and married her dad, who's like a rich land owning like white guy, and she has a sort of secret relationship, and like her reputation is on the line. So the fact that it's called Reputation makes a lot of sense, because it is about all these different characters like reputation essentially, and it also deals a lot with like gendered violence and sexual assault and stuff, so trigger warning for that for sure, because that's a really major thematic element, because the main character, who is like already in a really high class background, she is trying to get involved. She's like thinking that this guy is going to marry her, but it's a whole complicated situation. It's like very, you know, it's like petty drama, but in an interesting way, I guess. Okay, so the next book that I read was this science fiction novella called Fina. It's about this like couple who work at this like something that's very similar to an IKEA essentially, but these like wormholes get open up. Well, okay, it's not a couple because they had just broken up, and one of them is non-binary. We're in the mind of this girl, like from her perspective, and she and her ex-partner have to go try to find this old lady who's been lost in this IKEA world called FINA, and it's very much about like capitalism and like the corporate world and like working as an employee there, and then the fucking shit that you have to put up with, and also the different like multiverses that you explore. It was really, really fun, and it was a really short book, but I had a really good time with it. So I rated it 4 stars, and I think that the cover is like fine, but also the title, I'm really not a fan of this. But it does feel kind of like a campy, like Black Mirror episode or something like that. It's like, you know, that type of science fiction. Kind of reminds me of the book Horror Store by Grady Hendrix as well. But Horror Store is a horror book, obviously, and this is just like a straight up sci-fi essentially. But then I read a short story called I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream by Harlan Ellison, which is a classic horror dystopian short story that I just read online for free, and it was very misogynistic, but I liked the ideas that I was exploring. It's like basically about these like AI gods who have like trapped the last vestiges of humanity, which is like 5 people, and it just tortures them over and over. So it's like really, it's dark, it's grim, but I mean, I think that the title and this cover is really spooky and dark and gripping. So I mean, read it if you want to like experience those vibes, but there's not much substance there, and I feel like there's so many other science fiction books and stories that have explored this exact concept in like a much more interesting way, I guess. Then the next book that I read was a nonfiction essay collection called The Right to Sex, Feminism in the 21st Century by Amia Srinivasan, and I think that this was a really well-researched and contemporary contextualization of a lot of canonical feminist texts. She references a lot of like Catherine McKinnon. She references like, I think, some bell hooks and just various feminist thinkers that people are familiar with, and she looks at a bunch of different types of feminism, and she talks about a lot of different things like porn, like Title IX, like the Me Too movement and what that has looked like. I think it's well researched, it's interesting, it's compelling. I don't know whether it's not really answering a lot of questions, I don't think. I think it is bringing up questions, and it is a really interesting book on feminism, and I came into it with like pretty low expectations, but I think that it was actually like really well done. And the author is a professor in like women and gender studies, I think, the author is a professor in philosophy at Oxford University, and like it kind of shows because she also draws on her own experiences in academia as well. And I think there's an essay in here called On Not Fucking Your Students or something like that, on not sleeping with your students, and that was an interesting chapter. There's a chapter that was about like incels, and that's what the title of this book is about, The Right to Sex, like who is the right, and she goes into like the nuance of that. It's like, what is desirability politics and what are they informed by, but then how what about your choices and who you think that you're attracted to, versus there's like the racial politics of that and like the gender politics. It's really interesting. I thought it was good, but I there were some chapters that I was like, I don't know if this is good. I don't know if like, you know, I don't think you're saying anything new necessarily, which not every book has to, but yeah, so I rated it 4 stars. The next book that I read was Nobody, Somebody, Anybody by Kelly McLorey, and my friend Perks of Steph was pushing me to read this like more than a year ago, and I really liked it. It's about this woman who is a chambermaid essentially at this like resort hotel thing, and she has dreams of being an EMT, and then she sort of like deludes herself into pretending that she's an EMT, and then she gets into this weird like friendship. She has no friends. She gets into this weird friendship with her landlord Gary, who has a Ukrainian wife who is about to come over from Ukraine. It's very strange, but I think that the prose was really good, and I think that us following this like delusional young woman and how lonely and like mentally ill she is, and also the fact that her mother had died recently, like I think that was all really well done, and it was very absurdist but in an enjoyable way, and it was very funny in others as well. The next book that I read was another nonfiction book called Disfigured, on fairy tales, disability, and making space by Amanda LeDuc. It's exactly what the title is saying. Oh, I love the title. I love the cover. I just 5 out of 5 for both of those things. Anyway, Disfigured, it's like less of an academic text and more of a personal memoir interwoven with the idea of like fairy tales and the representation of disfigurement and disability in traditional narratives. I don't think it was necessarily saying anything that was new to at least to me, and like conceptually kind of similar to The Right to Sex, but I still think it was really well done, and I liked it. I think that the cover and the title are perfect for what this book is, and I think it's a good introduction to this type of literature. It's not as heavy, and even at the very beginning of the book, LeDuc, she says this is not meant to be like disability like theory. There's plenty of that already. It's more of like a compilation of her own experiences and her own thoughts. Okay, I have to go, but I will finish this wrap up later, but I will obviously like look different and stuff. Oh, also I'm like sitting in a different part of my room for this video. Let me know what you think. I don't know. I think the lighting is better because I'm more face on to the window where the light comes on, whereas in my typical setting it's usually just on one side of my face. Anyway, you probably don't give a fuck. So yeah, I will see you in like a second for you, but for me probably later. Okay, so the last book that I read, or the last book that I talked about in this video, was Disfigured by Amanda LeDuc, right? Anyways, the next book that I read in the month of April? Yeah, in the month of April was Insomnia by Sara Pinborough. This book is set in England and the author is English. It's a horror thriller type of novel, and we're following a mom who has insomnia. Like, she can't go to sleep, she can't sleep for some reason. She doesn't really know why this is happening, but she does, because when she was a child, she experienced something traumatic related to her mother, and she and her sister had to go through some shit. Her sister has just come back in town, and our main character is slowly approaching her 40th birthday. And that is significant because her mother kind of like went mad on her 40th birthday and like leading up to her 40th. And now our main character is currently experiencing a lot of the symptoms that her mother was experiencing leading up to that traumatic event. And she is really going through it. She's struggling with her job. She's a divorce attorney, I believe. Her marriage, and she has 2 children. Her youngest child is like a 5-year-old boy, and he is... something's not right. And her teenage daughter, there's stuff going on with that as well. It was a solid horror thriller. It had some like paranormal aspects, but you can't really tell whether it is that or if it's just the mental health issues that our main character is going through. I think that the dread and anticipation that the plot built over the course of the story was really on point, and it definitely kept me hooked and kept me reading, but that dread also made me dread picking up the book, if that makes sense. But maybe that's just me as a reader. I rated this book 4 stars because I think that the way that it incorporated horror and thriller elements to ultimately explore like complicated mother-daughter relationships, the complicated realities of like mental health and trauma, generational trauma. Pretty solid way for this being like genre fiction of horror, which and like thriller, which I don't typically read as much, and when I do, I feel like I am disappointed more often than not. But this book didn't really disappoint me. It didn't really make me want to like stop reading at any significant point. So that's a win on my part. So yeah, I rated it 4 stars. I thought it was solid, but definitely not like a favorite of the year or anything. I don't think it's going to stay with me for a long time. I think that the concepts, more so than like the writing itself, is what is resonant. I think the title of Insomnia being Insomnia, yeah, it makes sense. And the cover is very creepy. I think it captures the vibes, but not really. I feel like Insomnia is kind of a cop-out for a name. I would rate the title, but it's like accurate, you know, so I'll rate the title like 3 stars, and I think the cover, pretty creepy, 4 stars. The next book that I read was another horror thriller, Near the Bone by Christina Henry. I rated this book 3 stars because I thought it was less enjoyable than Insomnia, but they're vastly different books. We're following our main character, who is this young woman who lives alone in the woods with her abusive husband, and there is a monstrous creature that has climbed up, that has lived in the cave in this mountain at some point. It's snowy, it's wintry, there's these explorers who are trying to track down like cryptids or whatever, and those cryptid hunters run into our main character, who is obviously being abused in the woods by this fucking weirdo freak dude. And it's ultimately a story about like abuse and grooming and the process of being traumatized in that way, and then also the isolation of the wilderness and ultimately like survival. It is very much a survival story of trying to escape, trying to run away from the monster, and I thought that it was fine, but I think that the way that the trauma and stuff is like portrayed, and the way that our main character is treated by obviously the character, her abuser in the book, but also like the author, I don't know, it didn't really sit right with me. I feel like so many horror books that try to deal with trauma in this way, in which we are already following a very traumatized character and then she is kind of experiencing her past as we go along throughout the book. I think this book didn't do it as well as it wanted to. It felt very much like a corny B-rated like horror film, just not that good. The writing wasn't that good in my opinion. I just think that the atmosphere was pretty solid and it was pretty chilling, and it like kept my heart rate up because I was like, what's going on, what's gonna happen, like this is kind of crazy, like I hope she survives this. It's basically, yeah, it's just a survival story, but our characters felt very one-dimensional. The reader knows more than the characters, particularly our main character, and she is experiencing a lot of fear and doubt because obviously she's being like isolated and abused in the woods, and she is focused on her own survival, and in some ways it has to deal with appeasing her abuser. And I just think that like, I don't know, I think that it was gripping and fast-paced, and I kept on reading, and I thought it was somewhat like enjoyable, but not enjoyable to read about this type of shit. So yeah, I rated it 3 stars. I thought it was fine. It was sort of underwhelming, but I didn't have that high of expectations going in the first place. Near the Bone, I think that the cover illustration is pretty accurate because that is how you should go into the book, or like that's how I went into the book picturing the setting. So I would rate the cover like 4.5 stars, but I think that the title Near the Bone, I don't, maybe that was part of the text and I didn't really catch on, and I didn't, like maybe there was a mention of that phrase Near the Bone within the story, and I just didn't notice, but like 2 stars for me. Okay, the next book that I read was Fight Night by Miriam Toews. This book is a really heartwarming literary fiction novel, pretty short or medium length, and it follows our main character who is 9 years old. Her name is Skiv? She has like a quirky short name. I'm really forgetting it. I don't remember character names at all. Anyway, we're following our main character who's 9 years old. She lives with her mom and her grandma. It's a very matriarchal, maternal sort of family dynamic, and both our main character, her mom, and her grandma are very, very quirky. Her mother is pregnant as well. They call the baby in her belly the gourd. They just refer to it as the gourd. And that was kind of silly. There are so many parts of this that were very silly and weird, but in a fun way that I thought was really endearing and enjoyable. I think this book was just very sweet and warm, and it deals with things like grief and family and loss and growing up. And our main character like will get into fights at school. She's kind of a badass, but she's 9, you know, and she and her mom are trying to take care of their ailing grandma, who is still very lively and fiery. I think this was a really sweet book. After I read it, I think I immediately gave it 3 stars, but now on reflection I'm giving it 4 because I think that it was very, very endearing as a book and very much a lovely little experience to read that's still incredibly heartbreaking at some points, I guess. I think that the cover art is pretty solid. I like it. I rate it 4 stars maybe. The title being Fight Night, I think is really cute because our main character, the 9-year-old girl, does get into fights at school, so she is suspended and or like expelled, and so instead she and her grandma do like homeschooling and they like run a newspaper together. It's sweet. So I would say that's like a 4-star title for me. The next book that I read was Little Scratch by Rebecca Watson. And I picked up this book because I think Brittany, oh my gosh, why am I forgetting her name? Yeah, a booktuber that I'm really into right now. She read this and really, really enjoyed it. So I decided to pick it up. It's very short. It's written in this form that's very poetic and choppy. And it's about this young woman who suffers from an eating disorder and self-harm, I believe, and she's in a relationship with this man, and it's just following her throughout the course of like a day, essentially. I think that what it was doing in terms of playing with form and structure was interesting enough, and it was very much like autofiction vibes, but it itself talked about autofiction, like it talked about the act of writing, because our main character is a writer and she's dealing with a slump of like not being able to deal with things. But I didn't really connect with it as much as I wanted to. I think that what ended up being fine. I liked it. It was enjoyable, but it wasn't that memorable for me personally, and I just think that has to do with like I'm not necessarily in a place in my life where I'm not the kind of person who like would relate to this main character, I suppose. So I rated it 3 stars because I think that it was well written and it was a short and quick read. But I feel like I've read books that explore trauma and self-harm and eating disorders in a better and different way within the same type of main character that our main character is. But I think that the poetic sort of form and the choppiness of it was what made this book interesting. So yeah, I rated it 3 stars. The next book that I read was The Thief by Megan Whalen Turner. This book has been so hyped up by so many like fantasy readers, and it's a YA fantasy, I think. Maybe just a fantasy about our main character who is a thief, and he ends up being sent to prison, and then this one guy, this like nobleman, is like, okay, I'm gonna take you out of prison so you can help me find this thing because you're a tracker and you can find this thing down. And so they go to try to find this mythical object from the gods and the goddesses. It's like a whole journey trip, which I don't know whether I'm that into because it was kind of frustrating and boring for me to read, and I just kind of wanted it to be over with. But by the time we got to the ending and there was that twist reveal, I was like, oh, okay, I get it now. All of the characters were like low-key very insufferable for the majority of this book, and the ending is what saved this book from being a 2-star because I rated it at 3 stars. But I don't know. I think that it just wasn't gripping or enjoyable for me in a way that it was gripping and enjoyable for other people. I did kind of want to know what happened, and I think that the mythical, fantastical elements were interesting, and I think our main character is an endearing and funny guy, but I don't know, I feel like I'm not that into reading about young male characters, like main characters. Those will just never be as interesting to me as young female main characters and young women who are on a quest. This guy, I don't know. There were some points that I was like, get your ass up, like, come on now. So, yeah, I thought it was fine. I rated it 3 stars. I think that the cover and the title, both kind of mid. I mean, the Thief as a title, like, yeah, okay, that's accurate to the story and also applies to the sort of reveal at the end, I suppose. So I would give it like a 3.5 star title. But in terms of the cover, I don't know, seems kind of ambiguous, but not as bad as some fantasy covers that I've seen. So I would give it like a 3-star cover. The next book that I read was The Bone Orchard by Sara A. Mueller, and I talk about this and read this in my most recent reading vlog, my Lesbian Visibility Week reading vlog, and this is like a high fantasy that I really enjoyed. I rated it 4.5 stars. I thought it was a beautiful, brilliantly constructed. It's a fantasy world that really contends with the reality of patriarchy and misogyny, and also the concepts of mind control and split selves in a really, really cool way. The basic premise is not very basic at all because, again, this is a really complex, constructed fantasy world. Basically, we're following our main character, who is a madam, and as a madam of a brothel that she runs, she's also the mistress to the emperor, and at the beginning of the book, the emperor passes away, but she has a mind lock, which is basically like some piece of magic technology that goes into the side of her mind that controls her ability to do things and move about the world. She cannot disobey the emperor's orders, but she also has split selves, and that goes in sort of a couple different directions. In her own body, there is another part of her called the Ladee, and the Ladee is very concerned with ideas of propriety and like being courtly and a noble woman. But obviously the madam, she's concerned with like survival and running this house. And the Ladee has constructed these bone ghosts that are manifestations of Mistress Charm, the madam, Mistress Charm's selves. There's like pain, there's desire, there's justice, there's these different like bone ghosts, right? These different entities that are semi-human, and they function as the prostitutes for this house. But because the emperor's last dying wish for Mistress Charm was to find the person who murdered him and kill that person, she has to do all this political machinations and maneuvering to figure out what's going on, and she has to use her different selves and identities to try to manipulate what's going on. And there's also other greater political powers at play, as well as the noble women who and the noble men who come into her brothel and come into her house, and it's fascinating. I thought it was really, really cool. I really enjoyed it. I rated it 4.5 stars. This cover, beautiful. 5 stars. The title, The Bone Orchard, 5 stars. Like, because the Bone Orchard refers to the place right behind the brothels, like it's like the field right behind the brothel, and it's where the lady who has the magical capabilities to create these bone ghosts, like, constructs the bone ghosts, and it's crazy. I really enjoyed it. These next few books are also books that I featured in my Lesbian Visibility Week reading vlog, but this book is In Bloom by Allie Keane. I didn't like it. I rated it 2 stars. Corny ass cover, corny ass title, 2 star all around. 2.5 star actually is what I rated it on Goodreads, because I don't like giving sapphic romances low star ratings, because even if they aren't great, I feel like because I'm not a big romance reader, maybe I'm not the best judge of that, and I think other romance readers would enjoy it. I just personally find it kind of corny. I can't really get through a lot of the romances that people recommend. This is why I prefer historical romances, because when historical romances are corny, well, first of all, it's more involved in terms of the world building and fleshing out the characters and the class systems, because it's so much more rigid in a historical setting, whereas in a contemporary setting, it's easy for it to be very vague, and I feel like they all take on this tone of writing that are so kind of removed, but just not interesting for me. I didn't really like it. So yeah, I rated it 2.5 stars. If you want to know more of my thoughts and feelings, you can watch the vlog. The next thing I read in the month of April was a play called Fireworks by Dalia Taha. And this play is set in Palestine sometime in the 21st century. It's right before Eid and on Eid. That's sort of the time span of what this play is following, and we're following these 2 different families. One of the families, the brother has died due to, I think, either a bombing or being shot by an IOF soldier, and this play ultimately just deals with the day-to-day trauma and grief and suffering of Palestinian children and families, and the reality of living under occupation, living in war. It was beautiful and heartbreaking. It's such a necessary and important play. It takes on some surreal elements, but ultimately the horror of it is in its realism. The dialogue is very much an embodiment of that trauma and how it manifests in people's interpersonal relationships and in families. It was really beautiful. I didn't rate it because it's such a personal story, and it's also a play, you know? It's like 80 pages of a script. It's pretty short for a play. I really, really recommend it though. I had a heartbreaking time reading this. The next book that I read was a book that I read for the reading vlog as well, and that book is Winter Love by Han Soo-yin. This book is set in World War II London or England, and we're following our main character who is in various lesbian relationships, but a primary one with this other girl named Mara, and they're both young women. They both end up getting married at some point within the novel. It very much is about lesbian desire within the context of like wartime and within this time period. It's a very reminiscent of like a lesbian period drama. If you want to know more about this, watch the vlog. I really enjoyed it. I rated it 4.5 stars. The next book that I read was another 4.5 star lesbian read, which I read in the vlog, and that is Spear by Nicola Griffith. And this book is a lesbian retelling of the Arthurian legend, and it was incredible. I love a badass butch main character who is a master at killing people and survival, and it's just so slay and amazing. If you want to know more of my thoughts, watch the vlog. Again, beautiful cover, amazing title, amazing book all around. 4.5 star for the book because I would have given it 5 stars, but it didn't give me that oomph at the end. At the beginning, in the first half, I was like, whoa, this is gonna be a 5-star book, but towards the end, I was like, there's so many characters, so much shit is going on, and I did really enjoy it, but I knocked it down like half a star, but 5-star cover and title for sure. And then the next book that I read in the vlog was Mona by Paula Olisaro. I don't know, I'm not pronouncing that right, but this book is a pretty short literary fiction novel following our main character who is a Peruvian author, I believe. This book is translated from Spanish. It's written by an Argentinian writer, I believe, but the book is about a Peruvian writer who is a young graduate student at Stanford, and she goes to a literary conference or award in Sweden, and at this award ceremony she is meeting all these other big literary characters and names from around the world, and it's quite funny and acerbic and witty, but it also deals with a lot of trauma, the trauma of being a young woman, as well as the bullshit of being a writer and being among other writers. I thought that it was really solid. I think that our main character's thoughts and opinions are very questionable, as are all of the other characters we meet, but I think that that doesn't stop me from loving this book, and this is my second 5-star fiction read of the year. My last 5-star fiction read of the year I mentioned in my previous wrap-up, if you want to watch that. This book I really enjoyed. I think that the ending being so absurdist and ridiculous and like surreal was perfect, and it really made me elevate this book from like a 4-star to a 5-star read. And I know it's probably unpopular because this is like a 3.3 star rating on Goodreads, but I loved it. Translated fiction, like I love that shit, and this is no exception. I rated it 5 stars, like I said, and the cover and the title, both 5 stars as well, like amazing. Alright, and finally, I really enjoyed Nicola Griffith's other book, So Lucky, and this is a autobiography, and this is a 5-star read for me as well, but I would consider it nonfiction because it is autobiographical. It is about a lesbian middle-aged woman who has just ended like a long-term marriage with her wife, and she also, within the course of the story, very early on, gets diagnosed with a chronic illness, and she ends up getting involved in the chronic illness disability community online and in real life, and the chronic illness sort of gets embodied in a surreal sort of way. The way that this book explores queer identity and queer desire and disability and the reality of living as a disabled person and the struggles of that, especially because our main character, or I guess the author, she gives herself a different name for this book, I believe, but our main character is on an administrative position level of an HIV/AIDS nonprofit, and because of her experience and background in being able to divvy up funds and manage a nonprofit, we also get that side of things as well. I thought it was phenomenally written, so moving, so beautiful, and incredible. I think that the title is perfect and the cover I really enjoy. So 5 stars all around. but again, it's not fiction. I think there are fictional elements probably, but it's not autofiction. I think it is described as autobiographical. This book is beautifully written. I think that the cover and the title are both 5 stars for me, and it is just a gorgeous and heartbreaking depiction of the reality of being a queer woman who is dealing with a disability and struggling through her life with her relationships to her new lover, her relationship to her ex-wife, and her relationship to a friend from work whom she ropes into starting another nonprofit with her regarding disability activism. This book was beautiful and I rated it 5 stars. I highly recommend you read it. It's pretty short as well. I listened to the audiobook, which was amazing, and yeah, I loved it. It was read by the author as well. So those are all of the books that I read in the month of April. Let me know your thoughts on anything that I've read, if you have read it as well, or if any of these books sound interesting to you and which one you would want to pick up. Thank you so much for watching, and please like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you so much for watching once again, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!